what I love about commercial is there are actually no rules. It is actually the Wild West. You can negotiate and put anything you want on a contract. So industrial and retail are my sweet spot. And by retail, like I said, I mean the suburban essential retail. So the barbershops, the cafes, the medical centres, the physiotherapies, things like that. I think they're going to have the most kind of capital growth. And they've also got the most demand at the moment because of the yields.
Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how and where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, and sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You will hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested. Hi, freedom fighters. What are you investing in now? Or are you just sitting on the sidelines because you're just not sure what to invest in when? Because everything just seems to be at all-time highs and you're worried about a crash. Perhaps you're cashed up and waiting for the right thing and the right time to jump in, but you're just not sure what and when. Or are you one of the many who continues to fool yourself into thinking that just paying off your home loan and sticking your hard-earned coin into superannuation is going to allow yourself to enjoy a comfortable lifestyle when you retire or stop work? As I've mentioned repeatedly on Get Invested, if you want to become wealthy with time on your hands, you'll have absolutely no choice but to invest well beyond your super. But what do you invest in? Cash flow and rental yields on rental properties are under threat and compression as a result of rapidly rising residential prices. And there's a strong risk and probability of a major correction and drawdown in the overheated and overvalued share and equities markets. And cryptocurrency value volatility just continues to go up and down like a bride's nightie overnight. So where else can you invest in a way that is still safe, affordable, and provides steady growth potential and strong cash flow yields? What are your options? What if you could invest in an asset class that can give you a form of financial freedom that other investments can't? I'm talking here about commercial property, which is enjoying a newfound popularity and is actually the flavour of the month at the moment amongst many investors who have become disillusioned with overheated traditional residential property and stock market investing and are looking for alternatives. So today, I thought we'd revisit the ins and outs of commercial property so that you can look at it on its merits as an extension of my previous discussions on this subject that you can find in past Get Invested episodes 44 and 174. And to help us on this journey so that you can make more informed decisions on whether commercial property is for you, we're joined by leading commercial property investor turned commercial buyer's agent, Steve Palise from Palise Property, who has recently released his great book that gives you a comprehensive rundown on the entire commercial property arena, which is appropriately titled Commercial Property Investing Explained Simply. And we're going to draw on some of his book in this intro and throughout our engaging discussion today. As Steve says, commercial property is sometimes viewed as risky when really it's just not well understood. Certainly, the dynamics of commercial property are different, but they're no more complicated. They just need to be explained simply, and Steve's book does a great job of it doing exactly that. Now, Steve's book isn't aimed at convincing you that investing in commercial property is the best and only option for you, as investing in shares or residential property also has huge advantages if you know what you're doing. But in his view, commercial real estate can add to and accelerate your financial freedom in a way that other investments can't. Now, if you're interested in shares or residential property, there are countless blogs, magazines, newspapers, podcasts and websites to keep you informed and make you a better educated investor. However, there are very few resources for people interested in commercial real estate. So Steve's book will help you close this knowledge gap in a very easy to read and no-nonsense way. And Steve has now purchased hundreds of commercial properties for his clients, and he's constantly had to explain the benefits of commercial property and the misconceptions about it. Now, this has inspired him to write a summary of the key points to commercial investing, which has evolved into his book, which I'll now quote some extracts from to whet your appetite out to find more. Commercial property can include any property that is held for the purpose of generating a return on investment. And it comes in many forms, including industrial, retail and office, and a combination of commercial and residential properties. And all forms can be profitable investments, as Steve well demonstrates in his book. Long considered a more niche alternative to traditional investments, in recent years, commercial real estate has started moving to the mainstream as a highly sought-after asset. Some of the benefits of commercial property investing include high cash flow returns, stability of income, low long-term risk, exposure to different sectors of the economy, superior tax benefits that provide a great hedge against inflation. It gives you enhanced investment control with the ability to add value and strong leverage. So, how can you decide whether commercial property investing is right for you and should be part of your portfolio? Let's look at some of the key differences between residential and commercial property. Let's start with deposits. For commercial property, you'll need a much larger deposit than you do for residential. Lenders generally allow a loan-to-valuation ratio, or LVR, of only 60 to 70% for commercial property, with some going up to 80%. Whereas residential property lenders will allow LVRs of 80 to 90% or even up to 95%. In other words, you'll need a 5 to 20% deposit for a house or a unit compared to a 20 to 40% deposit for a commercial property. So the first perceived disadvantage of a commercial property is that the cost to get into the market is much higher. As an example, a number of commercial specialists suggest that the sweet spot for commercial property is in the $1 million to $2 million plus price range. So, based on a 5% establishment cost addition, you'll need to come up with a deposit from savings or equity in other property of between $350,000 for a $1 million property or $700,000 for a $2 million property. Now, this is generally a big hurdle for first-time investors, so it's generally best suited to experienced investors who start in residential for superior growth and then access accumulating equity in their residential properties to create the deposit for a commercial property. The next comparison is due diligence. Now, compared to residential properties, commercial properties require an enormous amount of due diligence. You'll need to investigate and consider the asset type, the vacancy rate for that type of asset, the foot and road traffic around it, and conduct building inspections, a lease review, and a tenant review just as a starting point, requiring a significant upfront sunk cost just to decide if you want to make an offer on a property. Now, I strongly advise using an expert and experienced commercial buyer's agent to do this for you, as you simply won't know what you don't know, and you won't know what to look for if you try and do this yourself. Next, we need to look at rental yields and cash flows. Higher yields are the thing that most often spoken about when it comes to commercial property. Residential property yields are gross yields, whereas commercial property yields are typically given as net yields. With residential property, the gross yields are typically between 3 and 6%, And owning a residential property incurs considerable outgoings such as council rates, water rates, body corporate fees and maintenance, etc. These costs reduce the net yield down to just within the vicinity of 1 to 3% after the outgoings. Commercial properties, by comparison, will, on average, have a 5 to 8% net yield. That's more than double. The reason it's referred to as a net yield is that the tenants will usually be responsible for 100% of the outgoings with commercial property. And as you'll hear, with commercial property, you can receive a much greater multiplier of the net cash flow return. This is one of the key reasons measured investors prefer to build a commercial property portfolio. Leases are next. There's a perception that commercial leases are more confusing than residential ones. Now, in the past, this may have been the case, as they were quite convoluted, but leases are now quite standard and much easier to read. Nonetheless, it's advisable to have a solicitor look over commercial leases, whereas with residential, it's generally enough for you and the property manager to check out the lease clauses. Leases on both residential and commercial properties can be as little as month to month. However, residential leases are generally only 6 to 12 months, whereas commercial leases range anywhere from a year to 30 years long. So commercial leases are traditionally much longer than residential leases. Bonds are the next variable to compare. Residential properties usually have only a 1-month bond, while commercial properties typically have a bond of 1 to 6 months. They can also have a bank guarantee for fulfilling the lease. A bank guarantee is a formal assurance by the tenant's bank that an amount of money will be paid to the landlord if the tenant does not fulfil their obligations under the lease agreement. It's worth noting here that with residential property, the eviction process can take months and involves complicated legal proceedings. Evicting a commercial tenant is often much simpler with less red tape, as the property is not their home. Let's now turn to outgoings. With residential properties, the owner is responsible for most costs, such as council and water rates, repairs and maintenance. With commercial property, the tenant is typically responsible for most, if not all, of the outgoings, which means a much higher cash flow return for the owner. Now let's consider repairs. In most cases, a commercial tenant is responsible for the property's internal fit-out and shop front. The presentation of the property can be tied to their lease too, so that the tenant's required to maintain it or risk breaching their lease and having it terminated. Commercial tenants will look after the premises generally though, because they paid for the fit-out and pay the cost of the maintenance. The condition and appearance of the property reflects on the business, meaning that they're more likely to look after the premises in order to make a good impression on their customers. They're also liable for the health and safety aspects of the property, for both staff and customer safety, and are likely to apply a higher level of security features such as alarms, security guards and CCTV. The property will not be left unattended for a long period of time without your knowledge. Depreciation is also a big consideration. Unusually, for all real estate investment, including commercial, the depreciation is tax deductible. No other asset class has this advantage. And depending on the age and style of the building, a commercial property will usually have higher depreciation due to the more expensive construction and fit out. So this can be a real advantage, as higher depreciation means greater tax deductions for the owner, which in turn improves the effective cash flow affordability. Vacancy rates are also a significant point of difference between residential and commercial property. Residential properties in a well-chosen area will usually have a vacancy rate of somewhere between 1 and 4 weeks per annum. There will generally be a higher turnover of tenants due to the shorter leases, as tenants may choose to move for work because they've received a pay rise or lost their job, in order to buy a home, or because their relationship status has changed. Tenants of commercial properties, by contrast, are less likely to move because their livelihood is attached to the business and they've generally paid for the fit out. However, commercial properties in a high demand region will typically have a vacancy rate of, on average, somewhere between 1 to 6 months or more, sometimes up to a couple of years. And getting it wrong in commercial property can mean long periods of vacancy. With vacant properties, having the right marketing agent and the property's rent priced correctly can assist in leasing the property much more quickly. Being able to afford to continue to pay the loan if your tenants move out is an important consideration here. So you need to have a sizable rainy day reserve of funds to fall back on to cover this eventuality. And even with a good commercial property, you still need a bigger cash buffer to cover aspects such as longer periods of vacancy, upgrades to the property, or rental concessions such as rent-free periods for tenant fit-out. Next comes cash flow. Many residential properties are negatively geared, which means that you're losing cash flow in the hope that the capital growth will outweigh the loss over time. By buying this way, you might at some point have problems servicing the loan, and you'll also need to keep your job to be able to keep paying the mortgage. It's possible to find some good quality, neutrally geared or slightly cash flow positive residential properties, but even so, banks apply a serviceability criterion that will give your portfolio a negative cash flow in their eyes in terms of future borrowings. In comparison, commercial property has a high cash flow and servicing the loan is less of an issue, meaning that, as an investor, you can keep expanding your portfolio. Then comes loan interest rates. Commercial loans will generally have higher interest rates compared to residential loans. This will typically be around 0.5 to 2% higher. However, this will completely depend on the type of loan, the deposit amount, the type of property, and the risk. One of the reasons why commercial loans have a slightly higher interest rate is because they have a shorter loan term. For example, amortised over 10 to 15 years instead of 30 years, or tied to the lease terms, which raises the monthly mortgage payment significantly. They also have a smaller secondary business market, so there's less competition between the lenders to provide a better rate. Capital growth is the next consideration. Steve believes that there's a myth that commercial properties don't grow in value as much as residential. Now, if this were the case, there'd be a huge disparity in prices. It's just not true though. Good commercial properties have shown at least the same growth as residential properties, though usually on a different cycle. Residential property relies purely on capital growth to make a net return. The perception is that there's a lack of growth in commercial property investment, but in Steve's view, this is incorrect. If this were the case, you'd be able to buy in the commercial market much more cheaply than in the residential market. It's true that different commercial asset classes have different growth rates, but there's much more to it than this, as Steve reveals in Chapter 12 of his book. Investment in commercial properties is based more on mathematical algorithms than on market growth fundamentals, whereas residential property investment is based on future growth potential. Now let's turn to property management. Residential properties require considerable effort to manage because the tenant is typically only responsible for their electricity bill and the council rates. The owner has to cover the cost of all other outgoings and maintenance. With commercial properties, on the other hand, the tenants are usually responsible for outgoings and maintenance, and so they require less work on the part of the owner. The tenant's livelihood depends on the property too, as mentioned earlier, so they're more inclined to care for it. And finally, let's consider value adding. Residential property investors often renovate or buy larger blocks to then build granny flats or even subdivide the property. Now, while these ventures can be profitable, that's usually the most value that the investor can add. Commercial property, as Steve details in his book, has the potential for many different kinds of development according to the type of asset class that you've purchased. The possibilities include changing the property's use, adding more tenancies, increasing the rent, creating new sources of revenue such as installing ATMs or solar power, or renting out parking, storage or advertising space. or adding mobile phone towers and repeaters. Commercial property in this regard is much more versatile. So, as you can hear from this overview, commercial property has both advantages and disadvantages for investors compared to residential. In this regard, the choice of what to invest in needs to be driven by two key things. Firstly, your purchase price capacity, as good commercial property generally comes at a much higher price tag with a substantially higher shortfall deposit required. Secondly, when you're at and where you're at on your wealth by stealth journey is really important, as I describe in my book, The Freedom Formula. In simple terms, if your income-producing investment nest egg is projected to be less than what's required to fund your ideal lifestyle, then you need to go for growth, which means that good quality residential property may be the place to start. And then, when your asset base is at the size it needs to be, then it's a matter of accessing accumulated equity and converting to cash flow where good commercial property comes to the fore. It's always a matter of horses for courses and investing in the right asset at the right time to grow and fund your ideal lifestyle. And it's imperative to never invest in something that you don't understand. It's too risky unless you seek reputable investment guidance. And from the commercial property front, this is where today's guest, Steve Palise, and his Palise Property team comes to your rescue. Having acquired an impressive property portfolio that's allowed him to leave the workforce sooner rather than later, he's now passionate about helping you and others to achieve your goals and financial freedom. Steve has worked for Australia's leading buyers agencies, executing more than 1,200 property acquisitions and acquiring hundreds of commercial properties for both himself and his clients. He's purchased in every capital city and all major regional towns in Australia. In his work, he draws on the mathematical and analytical skills developed in his previous life as a chartered mechanical and structural design engineer to break down what works best in commercial property. As with engineering, commercial property investment is based primarily on the numbers. Now, Steve's a licensed real estate agent, experienced in sourcing quality commercial property investments. His philosophy is that investment should increase your wealth and passive income with as little risk as possible. He's helped thousands of clients secure and purchase properties and believes property investing should not only be smart, but enjoyable along the way. In his great book, Commercial Property Investing Explained Simply, Steve educates you on the issues in commercial property investing and how to do it in a low-risk manner. He explains step-by-step how to analyse, select and buy commercial property, ensuring that the value of your investments will continuously increase, so you end up making as much money as possible with as little risk as possible. To grab yourself a copy, just go to www.paliseproperty.com/book, and that's Palise with P-A-L-I-S-E. That's P-A-L-I-S-E property.com/book. And if you want to reach out to Steve to get him to assist you on your commercial property investment journey, email him direct at steve@paliseproperty.com. Again, that's P-A-L-I-S-E property.com, or just click the link in the show notes. And if you want to start or continue investing in your knowledge, join me and many other like-minded investors in our Get Invested community right now. I send you a free and exclusive monthly email full of practical self-help and wealth wisdom that our current Freedom Fighter subscribers can't wait to get every month. It's full of investment and lifestyle tips, my personal book recommendations, apps I use to enhance life, and so much more. Just visit bushymartin.com.au and sign up at the bottom of the page, because this is just the beginning. In the meantime, enjoy this enlightening conversation with Steve Palise. Hi, Freedom Fighters. Now, unless you plan to work your way up the corporate ladder to CEO level, or to start a successful business, or invent something that goes off, you'll need to invest well to become wealthy and get time on your hands. So what are your options? Well, most people immediately think of shares or residential property. But what if you could invest in an asset class that can give you a form of financial freedom that other investments can't? I'm talking here about commercial property. Commercial property is sometimes viewed as risky when really it's just not well understood. The dynamics of commercial property are different, but no more complicated. They just need to be explained simply. And to do just that, I'm joined by a commercial property guru and author of a great new book on commercial property investing, Steve Palise. So welcome and let's get invested, Steve.
Hey, Bushy, how you going?
Really good, mate. Now, I know you're sitting on the other side of the planet at the moment on the good old UK, so I really appreciate you getting up bright and early in the morning to come and join us on the podcast.
No problem. I was one of those few that got to escape the COVID lockdowns, which is nice. So, yeah, can't complain.
We're jealous, mate. Now, mate, for those who don't know you, can you sort of kick it off by telling us who you are, what you do, and most importantly, why you do what you do?
Okay, so I'm Steve Palise. I'm a commercial property buyer's agent. So that basically means I go out and find good commercial property investment opportunities for clients and then hold their hand through the process. So find the properties, negotiate them, do all the due diligence on it, and then hold their hand through the settlement process as well. Why do I do what I do? I actually have no idea. I just love property. I've gravitated towards it. I used to be an engineer, which we can talk about later, and just fell into it. And I just enjoy it. It's just one of those things that blows my hair back.
Love your honesty, mate. Well, let's go immediately into your backstory, and I want to go into some detail if we can, and go back as far as you can remember, and then take us through your journey so far, focusing on where you've invested your time, your energy, and your money, what your learnings were, what the changes were, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and how that's led you back to what you're doing today.
Okay, that's fine. All right. So I had pretty humble beginnings. I grew up in Wentworthville in Western Sydney, which was a fairly low socioeconomic area at the time. Simple parents. My dad was a TV repairman working out of the garage. My mum was a stay-at-home mum. And we just had a nice, easy life. We were all into soccer. We all played like fairly high-level soccer. So mum was just a taxi service driving us around to 4 different games a week. I remember at one point in time I was playing 2 indoor soccer comps and 2 outdoor comps, and I'm one of 3 boys. So I can just imagine her drives now. I didn't realize it at the time, but she just must have been driving around constantly. So pretty much most of our time was sport and then just having some fun. And then when I got to school, I was pretty good at mathematics. So it was just one of those things I really kind of understood. And then studied my bum off, did really well in high school. Like I got 99.5 in the high school mark, and then chose to do engineering. So didn't want to be a doctor, didn't want to be a lawyer. I thought you had to choose to what high school mark you got. And then the next one down the list was engineering. So did mechatronic engineering, which is like designing like robotic limbs and things like that. Got all the way through uni, won the university medal, things like that. And then started my engineering job. Got into the medical industry, designing medical equipment, but I didn't actually enjoy sitting at a computer typing code all day, every day. So then decided to change it up and then went into mining. So I started designing mine sites. So I'm also a chartered structural and mechanical design engineer. So I've designed over 30 mine sites around Australia now. Did that for about 5 years. And then after that, my first property that I bought actually matched my income in the first year of its performance. So then I bought another property and another one, and I think I got up to about 6 or 7 properties, and I had a decent little passive income, a 30 or 40 grand passive income from it. And then just decided, I'm doing this all day, every day from 9 a.m. till 2 a.m. Why not make it as a job? And then just did the jump across into the buyer's agency.
Yeah, just sort of circling back there for a minute. What was the attraction into property in the first place, Steve?
So I'm one of those weird people, well, not weird people, but I'm one of those people that don't enjoy work. So I like my time. My time is my biggest asset. So having something where I don't have to turn up every day is perfect. Like, it's not that I don't enjoy working full days. I just don't want to do it on someone else's time. I don't want to be told, turn up at 9 o'clock, stay till 6. Here you've got a big project, you have to do 12-hour days. And then you see someone reap the benefit of making money. And that actually used to really grind my gears. So I was designed so I could save, say, 200 tons of steel on a project, which is a few $100,000, And if I did that, even though I'm increasing my risk because I'm taking steel out of the design, the sales guy was the one who made the profits because he came in under budget and he got a bonus and I didn't. So this through the corporate world used to really grind my gears a little bit.
And why property versus shares, equities, crypto? What was the attraction to property compared to other things?
It was probably just the commonality of it. Everyone spoke about it. There was a few guys at the time, so a few young kind of entrepreneur guys like the Nathan Birches and the Zachy Amirs and that were really publicising the little cheap cash flow properties. And I didn't have enough to buy an expensive property. Like my first one in Blacktown, the house there was 230 grand in 2012. So I just went into those kind of cheap asset classes, and I bought that one for 230, and then literally a year later it was getting valued at 320, and I was just like, this was way too easy. Why am I working? I was an intern at the time earning $65,000 a year. Why am I working 40, 50-hour weeks when I've just matched my salary and more just from signing a piece of paper?
Love it, mate. Love it. So you obviously built a fairly substantial resi portfolio initially. Why then the shift in, what led you into the commercial arena?
Yep. So I actually just fell into it. I was much like everyone else and just thought it was too risky. It wasn't understood well enough. So I was a resi buyer's agent for about 5 or 6 years, purchased over 500 residential properties now. And then I just had one client who said, oh, can you buy me a commercial property? And I used to try to actually talk him out of it at the time. And then once I actually started looking at it and just doing it with an analytical mind, you actually can mitigate most of the risk. And to be honest, you can actually buy lower risk ones in some residential properties at the moment. And then bought that one. And then once I saw the cash flow return on them, that just is a game changer for me. Having an asset that can pay itself off in 10 years was just unfathomable for me. And then a passive income for the rest of your life. And then buying one a month went to 2 a month. And now all of a sudden I'm buying 5, 10, 15, 20 a month.
Yeah. What's your personal portfolio look like now, if you don't mind sharing that with us?
So I've got quite a few properties. I'm actually going through a divorce at the moment. So it's probably going to be about half that. But I've got a solid, probably after the divorce, probably about a solid 100K passive income. Yeah,
nice. And that's predominantly now commercial, or you still got any resi in the mix?
No, still quite a lot of residential. I'm not against residential at all. It definitely serves a purpose with its leveraging and its growth potential. So no, I'm still off of that. But now that I'm at the point where I've got a good base portfolio, I probably won't go back to buying residential unless it's maybe down the track a principal place of residence. But buying commercial and just increasing my passive income is just, the focus at the moment.
Yeah, no, I love it, mate. So just sort of looking back on your personal investments to date then, talk us through what's been your best investment and why, and your worst investment and why.
All right. So the Blacktown was probably the best one just because it was the real kind of light bulb moment for me. I've got one which I tell people about sometimes. It's my best and my worst investment in one. So I bought a 1-bedroom apartment in Cairns about would have been 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah.
For $30,000. So just an absolute. It was rented out for $180 a week, nice. And the body corporate was like $50 a week. So just an absolute bargain. But the banks wouldn't lend to it, so I just bought it cash. So it was about $35,000 all up cash because of stamp duty and legals and all that type of stuff. Yeah. So awesome little cash flow generator, things like that. However, the reason it's probably my worst investment option is I shouldn't have bought it cash because the leveraging with property is why you buy property. So if I'd put that $35,000 into another, say, 230 grand property like my Blacktown one, that would now have an extra 400, 500 grand equity. So I did sell the Cairns one a couple of years ago for $85,000, which is a really good kind of return on investment. Yeah. But if I leveraged, I'd much rather have the $300,000, $400,000 equity now.
Yeah, really good lesson there, mate. And again, there's a lot of investors who don't understand the power of leverage if it's set up the right way to minimise the risk. So love the sharing on that one, mate. On the sort of looking forward in terms of your own lifestyle, then you mentioned earlier on that time's your most important asset. What's your ideal lifestyle look like, and what are you going to continue to invest into either create or sustain that lifestyle?
Yep. So for me, lifestyle is just basically doing the things that I enjoy. So I really like friendships, so hanging out with friends constantly whenever I can. Travel, like I've traveled over 40 countries now. Really love travel, and just not have to work when you don't want to work. If you want to take a month off, you can take a month off, and there's nothing kind of stopping you. So for me, it's all just about time, and I think that's the same for you, Bushy. We've had this discussion multiple times before. I just want time back. So that's the thing. In terms of keeping it forward, commercial property is still the option for me. It's just a nice little way that if you go and buy a $500,000 commercial property and it gives you $25,000 a year passive income, you can very quickly get to where you need to be.
Yeah, spot on. Absolutely agree. Mate, around a sort of similar subject, what would your definition of sustainable success look like?
Well, everyone's definition is going to be completely different. However, my one is where your wealth continues to increase and your passive income continues to increase with time without any input from yourself.
Great. Really good definition there, mate. And that last part's really important. No input from yourself, because if you're creating an empire, that means that you're working 60, 70 hours a week or more, then you're not really wealthy at all. You might be rich, but you're certainly not wealthy because you've got no time to enjoy it. So
exactly right.
Yeah, no, love that, mate. That's spot on. Well, mate, let's sort of leverage into the world of commercial property if we can, because there's certainly very mixed views about commercial property out there, and the media certainly hasn't helped the equation with sort of gloom and doom around the commercial office space since COVID's kicked in. But I'd love to give a more balanced view. So talk to us about what you think comes under the commercial property banner, so that people's ears and eyes are widened a little bit in terms of the scope and opportunity there.
Yep. So most people, when they talk commercial, they talk one of the three asset classes. So that's either industrial, retail, or office. At the moment, retail and office generally don't have the best name for them. But that's just because obviously one, with offices, COVID, people aren't going in. And retail, they're normally referring to things like the Westfield shopping centre. They're not referring to the local GP clinic or the barber shop or the cafe, things like that. So let's not get those confused. And industrial is doing really well at the moment. I can talk for hours on each. Do you want me to focus on any points, Bushy?
Well, not particularly, but I'd like you to sort of dive into an area of that exercise. Why don't we start off by doing a bit of a comparison between why you'd invest in commercial versus residential property, and who's best suited to do each and both of those, mate?
All right. So the main reason most investors invest in commercial is the cash flow. There is a misconception that they don't have capital growth, but that's completely false. They've actually almost got exactly the same capital growth as residential property. It just happens in different cycles. But most investors will buy it because you get really, really good cash flow. Like you can get 5, 6, 7% net returns. And that's not the same as a residential return. When people say, I'm getting a 5% return on for residential, that's a gross return. Whereas with commercial, it's a net return. And the reason it's net with commercial is the tenant pays the outgoings typically. So they'll pay the council rates, the water rates, maintenance and things like that. Whereas residential, you've got all those costs. So it's actually equivalent to about a 10 to 12% gross residential yield when you work it out. So
yeah, that's a pretty substantial difference.
Yeah. And then most people, once they've got that passive income, they'll buy into it. And they think I must have a residential base portfolio first, or they just think it's too risky and they don't invest. So they'll generally stay away. There are a lot more moving parts with commercial, so you do have to be mindful of that. But when you get it right, the rewards are there. However, if you don't know what you're doing and you get it wrong, you can obviously burn yourself quite easily, because if you buy, say, a warehouse and it sits there vacant for 2 or 3 years, that's going to sting. Whereas with residential, as long as you tick some of the fundamentals and you buy a good quality house in a good quality suburb, you're always going to have a tenant. So you're at least going to have that income coming in. So you just got to be very mindful of the risk, mitigating the risk of vacancy.
Yeah, spot on. Let's dig in a little bit more detail to some of those myths associated with commercial property if we can. And I wouldn't mind sort of diving in a bit deeper around the capital growth myth, because you mentioned that you can get the same capital growth but in different cycles. Let's expand on that a little bit, because I think that would be of real interest to people who have this perception that it's only about cash flow. Tell us a bit more about the capital growth opportunity.
Yep. So just a complete myth. So I don't know where it came from. I assume it's brokers and residential people just trying to scare people away. There are some types of commercial properties that don't grow the same as others, of course. So like office space, if you're buying a 20-story skyscraper office suite, that doesn't have a land component. So that's not going to have the same capital growth as a warehouse or a freestanding building, for instance. Much the same as a high density residential apartment doesn't have the same capital growth as a house. So you're not comparing apples and apples. They'll have different growth rates depending on what the asset class is. So like if I'm buying a warehouse, that still has a land component. Freestanding might be slightly different to a body corporate one. If I'm buying, say, like a medical center and it's a converted residential property, of course that's going to have capital growth because it's a residential property as the bare bones. So they'll all have slightly different capital growths, but on the last 30-year average, it's generally been between 4.5 and 6.2% anyway. And the residential market actually has to have some type of impact on it as well, because you don't have a house, say there's a $500,000 warehouse and it's sitting next to a $1 million residential property. That $1 million residential property doesn't go to $2 million, and then the warehouse still sits there at $500,000, because every single person living in that neighborhood with the $2 million house is going to start looking at that going, oh, I should buy that. That's quite cheap. So it flows on after that. So you can still get the capital growth. I actually predicting that we're actually going to get better capital growth out of commercial in the next 2 to 3 years as people shift their mindset to yield as opposed to capital growth. Yeah,
okay. And so the capital growth, as you're forecasting it, then is just demand driven. Is that what's going to drive it, do you think?
Yeah, but that's everything. Supply and demand is always where it comes from with residential as well. So just obviously low interest rates, increased demand, increased awareness as well. Like I'm having completely different phone conversations with clients now about commercial property. 5 years ago, you had to explain absolutely everything to them, like how a lease works, who pays what, things like that. But now people are actually quite aware of it. It's actually becoming a more common asset class.
Yeah, no, spot on. Let's dig into some of the other myths that are associated with it. And one of the big fears around commercial property is the potential for extended vacancy periods. Is that a myth? And what can investors do to mitigate that risk if it is one?
Yeah, all right. So that one actually isn't a myth, but you can buy ones that don't have a high vacancy. And it's similar to don't go out and buy a residential property in a mining town. That's high risk. So stick to the fundamentals. Whereas commercial, it depends what asset class you're buying. So I'll start off with, say, industrial. Industrial in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane at the moment, the vacancy rates are between 1.2 and 1.8%. So they're actually almost on par with the residential kind of field. So you will have a longer period of vacancy, but it's shorter. It's less common. So like with residential, you might lose your tenant, say, every 2 years for a week or two. Commercial, you'll typically say it's an industrial. You'll have the same tenant for 5 to 15 years, but when you lose them, you'll have, say, 3 to 6 months vacancy.
Yeah.
So you just get it all in one go. Where you buy and what you buy is obviously going to have different vacancy periods, much like residential. So the tip there is to make sure you do your due diligence. And it's not like the residential market where you can just go on a website and find out what the vacancy period is, because different sized warehouses, for instance, will have different vacancy periods. Where they are in the area, different access. Do they have a turning circle for a truck? What's the size of the roller doors? They all have different vacancy periods. So you really have to understand the asset that you're buying. And that just comes down to due diligence. You have to basically do it yourself. So you go through and find all the comparables in the area, when they went vacant, how long they were vacant for, what type of asset were they, and things like that. So once you do the work, you can basically expel that myth and actually buy a lower risk kind of vacancy period property. And they're also versatile. Like something like an industrial place can be a car mechanic, a wholesaler, distributor, fabricator, storage. Like it's got quite a lot of uses. So if you're buying a versatile one, you can mitigate the risk even more. Retail, for instance, that's a completely different kettle of fish to industrial. So Industrial, where you might be buying an area that services the local community. So it might be like a mechanic or a spray painter, or if you're buying near a major highway or a port or an airport, that's going to be more of a distribution-based business. So you kind of fit into those boxes there. Retail, it's all about foot traffic. So having the amount of people walk past is quite paramount. I don't buy obviously Westfields and things like that, and most everyday Australians aren't going to buy like a Westfield shopping centre because it's out in the reach, but most are going to buy like the little suburban street shops and medical and barber shops, cafes and things like that. Foot traffic's quite important there. Like when you're looking at vacancy periods, for instance, you can't look at one street back and compare it with the one on the main street. So you might get half the price, but they're not going to have the same capital growth or sustainability of the business. So that really got to look at where the people are coming from. Is the foot traffic? Is it a buzzing area? Even things like people are lazy. So if the car park is at one end of the strip, the retail strip, the ones towards the end actually have a higher period of vacancy than the ones towards the start, because people they get 3/4 of the way up and then they turn around. Yeah. So you need to look at things like that and then analyze the business. I'd say retail is slightly more risky than industrial if you're starting out, just because it is a lot harder to get a grasp on the vacancy periods. Yeah. But either way, still a good asset class. The COVID's actually increased a lot of those suburban retail strips. Like a lot of people are going to their local one now as opposed to the city. So they're actually quite good performers if you buy an essential service.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you mentioned the importance of due diligence. Why don't we just paint a bit of a picture here? Because from the little bit that you've shared and the reading I've done on your great book, the importance of due diligence is absolutely critical to, one, risk reduction, but also making sure that the property's ticking the boxes. Can you sort of let's take an industrial property as an example. Can you just sort of briefly take us through the key things that you would be doing around the due diligence to give you confidence around the potential for a property?
Yep. Okay. All right. So the first one, much the same as residential, is looking at the area that you're buying in. So is there population growth there? Is there infrastructure spending? What type of competition is in the area for your business? Things like that. So choosing the location is obviously the first one. And then once you've chosen that, you can actually go down and, is the industrial complex that you're buying in a good one? Is it clean and tidy? Does it have good access? Where is it servicing? As I mentioned before, like you really want to check, are you buying a service-based industrial? Are you buying a distribution-based one? That'll change the type of size and location you can get as well. So once you've narrowed that down and then actually found the property, you'll analyze the property on its own basis. So first thing I always do is check vacancy periods. So basically, I'll go through every warehouse in that complex and find if it went vacant, how long was it vacant for? Then I'll expand that search to the adjoining complexes and find that. So that way I can get some data for if they're getting filled in 2 months, 3 months, 8 months, 6 months. I know it's a fairly low risk asset if that population is growing and they're not building any more warehouses that's going to cause an oversupply. So once I've done that and I go, okay, this is a good low risk asset, then you start doing the hardcore due diligence, and that's checking things like the square meter rates for sale. So looking things like that, looking at the actual warehouse itself, like is the mezzanine approved and things like that. So it basically looking at the versatility. So what types of tenants you can get in, what different arrangements can you have? Is it that area more prone to having 30% office space or 50% office space to warehouse? And that's going to change on your location and the type of asset. So you're looking at things like that. And then if you're buying one with a tenant, which I normally recommend if you're starting out, so that way you get the cash flow from day one, investigating the tenant. So checking things like how long have they been there? Have they always paid rent? So like check their rental ledgers to make sure they're basically paying rent regularly. Who are their competition in the area? Are they established? Speak with the owner as well. So you can actually go, it's not like residential where you can actually call the owner and speak with the owner and find out what their plans are. And most of the time they're willing to talk to you because they don't want to be kicked out of their premises if they want to stay. And there's also no benefit to them telling you they want to stay if they don't, because they're on a lease anyway, so they can leave. Yep. So speak to the tenant, find out their plans, basically investigate that. And then part of that will be doing things like a lease review, looking through the contracts, the business, their financials, the rental ledgers, as I mentioned before, and just a really kind of strict kind of routine of checking everything to do with that business.
Yeah, yep, no, love it. Mate, in terms of where you're seeing the market at the moment, and where the ongoing opportunity is going to be in the medium term, where's the sweet spot? What sort of property and what sort of price point is giving the best results from both a yield and a growth perspective?
Yeah. All right. So the two I really like at the moment is industrial and retail. I'm not touching office unless there's an X factor about it, like we're buying a whole office block or something like that, just because, as everyone knows, it's going to be a huge unknown for the next 5 years, and most businesses aren't going to go back any more than 3-4 days a week tops. So staying away from that. So industrial and retail are my sweet spot. And by retail, like I said, I mean the suburban essential retail. So the barbershops, the cafes, the medical centres, the physiotherapies, things like that. I think they're going to have the most kind of capital growth. And they're also got the most demand at the moment because of the yields.
Yeah.
In terms of price point, I get asked this question a lot. I normally get asked, is it better to buy two $500,000 properties or one $1 million one? But it actually depends. So the benefit of buying, say, two $500,000 properties is you're going to have two different properties in different locations with two different tenants. So that way, if you lose one of the tenants, you've still got the other one basically covering the mortgage on the other property as well. So there's the benefit there. The negative with it is the tenants are generally a lower quality. You're not going to get a Bunnings, for instance, or a Kennards. It's going to be a average Joe's electrical service, probably a 2 or 3 man kind of show. And that's kind of it. So they're a bit more volatile because small businesses go one or two ways. They either outgrow the space or they'll buy their own premise, for instance, or they close up shop. So you'll actually go through a new tenant on one of those on average every 5 to 7 years. And that's just because they're either going to expand and move the spot. You can get lucky, obviously, and have the same tenant for 20 years, but just on average, you'll probably go through a tenant quite regularly.
Yep.
One of the other benefits is once they leave, there's actually quite a lot of sole traders looking for small spaces that you basically in that price range. So vacancy period's actually really tight. Like some of the areas I buy, they're 1 to 3 months for those types of asset classes.
Yep.
So there's that positive there. You'll generally be part of a body corporate. You're not going to buy a freestanding property for $500,000. So you don't have any value add opportunities. It's just going to be a nice little nest egg, set and forget with a tenant, move on kind of thing. Yeah. Whereas buying the $1 million plus ones, you get a bit more variety. So one, you get a bigger class tenant. So you're going to get something with like 20, 30 people in the business, and they normally rent for longer periods. So it's no longer a 5 to 7 year. You're generally going to have them 7 to 15 years. Yeah. So there's that benefit there. You can start looking at freestanding properties and warehouses as well. So that gives you value add with land. Like you can subdivide, you can do separate tenancies inside the warehouse. You can rent out laydown areas and things like that.
Yep.
So you've got that benefit. If that tenant leaves though, you've generally got a longer period of vacancy because there's not 1,000 big businesses just sitting there waiting for your property to come up. So those are normally 6 to 24 months period, but the tenant coming on is going to sign a longer lease as well. Like it's not going to be like the small one where they sign a 2x2 or 3x3. You might actually get a 5x5 or a 10x10. So you get a longer lease. So there's pros and cons to each. As I tell everyone, a good cheap property outperforms a mediocre big property and vice versa. So it's just going to come down to basically a case by case. I will say though, once you move up into that kind of the higher end, that 3 mil plus, you do start getting more creative kind of deals. And that's like the multi-tenancies, the little shopping centers, multi-tenancy warehouses and things like that. But for the everyday investor, there's not that much difference from a $300,000 warehouse and an $800,000. It just changes the location, the floor size, and the type of tenant that you're going to get.
Yeah, okay, love it. So let's run through a sort of typical scenario so that people have got a better handle on all this, how it comes together, and sort of run through the numbers a little bit. Let's make it easy. Let's say that we're looking at $1 million property. Given that the lending fraternity is very different in the commercial space versus the resi space, run us through what sort of deposit that we're going to have up the sleeve to even kick it off.
All right, so that's one of the key differences with commercial, and why it's not right for everyone is you typically will need a bigger deposit. So most lenders will do a 70% LVR, so you'll need a 30% deposit.
Yeah.
However, there are a couple of lenders at the moment doing 80% loans, like ANZ are doing a really competitive kind of sub 2 million or 80% loan. So that's bringing it on par slightly. So you will need that big deposit. So 30% on $1 million property is quite a lot. There's 300,000 there. Then you've obviously got stamp duty, which is approximately the same as residential, it's about 3.4%. So there's $35,000 there. Extra costs. So you same as residential, you're going to have your conveyancer and solicitor. They're generally a little bit more expensive, mainly because they're a bit more qualified. Probably the wrong way. A bit more experienced in commercial, I'll say. And they'll do some extra things like lease reviews and things like that. So on a $1 million one, you're probably looking at about $2,000 to $3,000 there for a conveyancer. If you get a lease review and things like that, maybe add like another $500 to $1,000 if you're doing extra searches. Build and pest inspection, as always, it's generally going to be somewhere between $400 and $800, depending on who and what you use. And then one of the costs that most people don't budget for is slightly different is the banks charge you. Banks charge you for the valuations. So that's some of those are quite expensive, but it's generally between about $800 and $2,500, depending on the property and the location, things like that. You have to pay that whether or not you're proceeding with the property. So that's the cost. If you're going to crash on finance, you still have to pay that cost, which a lot of people forget about.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. So that pretty much wraps it up. So on a $1 million property, we need the raw deposit of about 300, and then we're going to add roughly 50 odd grand on top of that for your on costs. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, I always just budget about 35%. So when I'm doing my calculations and I work out purchase price or how much I got to spend, it's 35%. So I add an extra 5% purchasing costs. Yeah,
okay. And you've touched on some of the risks already, but just to highlight the full extent of risks that people need to be aware of and then need to mitigate, what else do they need to be thinking about other than the vacancy rates?
So looking at who the tenant is and the strength of the lease is probably a quite important one as well. People think because there's a lease in place that they have to pay the rent, but if you've got a company that folds financially, are you actually going to go down the rabbit hole and try to sue them for the money? Probably not. You're probably just going to try to find a tenant. So just having a lease, even though it's a legal document, I refer to it as a rule book between the owner and the tenant. So it's not fixed. It's always fluid. Obviously, COVID as well, when that hit, you had to give concessions and things like that, even though that wasn't in the lease. But just be very mindful of looking at what type of bond that you have on the lease. So basically, same as residential, how much money they put down for it. And then you can also have guarantors of the lease as well. So you can have personal or company guarantors. Find out basically who they are, how much money they've got, what their finances are, and then how much they're backing that the actual lease is there. And that's the way to protect yourself.
Yeah, okay. No, that makes that fairly clear. Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier in the conversation the potential ability to pay off a commercial property in a fraction of the time of residential. Talk that through a little bit more, because that's in terms of creating a truly passive income, that's very attractive. So can you give us a little bit more detail around that?
Yeah, that's fine. So it's just basically because it has such a high cash flow, if you put that cash flow back into the property, it actually pays itself off quite quickly. So normally you're on the 70% loan. So if say I buy a $1 million property and it's on a 6% net yield, that's 60,000 coming in. If you've got a fairly low interest rate, so 2.4%, you're generally talking about 50 grand a year passive income from the get-go. So if you put that $50,000 back into the loan each year, generally within 9 to 11 years, that debt's free. And then you're going to have, assuming no rental increases, you're going to have a $60,000, $70,000 passive income for the rest of your life just by buying $1 million commercial property. And this is why I always talk risk with clients when they say, oh, no, commercial's riskier. I go, well, if I pay mine off in 10 years, where's the risk? Whereas they're going out buying a $1 million property, a residential property, they have to pay off over 30 years, where they basically have to make up the difference between the rent and the repayments. So I'd actually argue that mine is actually lower risk, assuming I buy a good one that has tight vacancy. And for me, that's the game changer. Like most people's passive income goal is $100,000 or $200,000. So by buying $1 million property, you can get bloody close to getting there within 10 years.
Yeah, that's absolutely sensational, mate. And that level of income just makes the resi side of the equation pale into insignificance. And for those investors who are at the sort of back end of their investment journey, who are now more interested in cash flow than growth, then you're going to be very hard to beat a good quality commercial property from that ongoing passive income perspective.
Yeah, and that's one of the questions I get asked all the time is when do I actually buy a commercial property? When's it right for me? And again, it's going to depend on your personal circumstances. Like if I get a 22-year-old client and he comes to me, he goes, I want a passive income of 50 grand, 100 grand. I'll probably still get him to buy a residential property because he's got leveraging on his side. So he can get 90 and 80% loans. So he can really leverage up. And I know he's going to be working the next 5-10 years. Like it's very unlikely he's just going to pack it up in 3 years' time without earning any income. So for him, leveraging and capital growth is the focus. And a lot of people say, you got to have a base portfolio first before commercial. Again, it depends on the person. If a 65-year-old client comes to me and he doesn't own any residential property, but he's got $2 million and he wants a passive income, I'm probably not going residential because that is no benefit to him. I'm going to buy the high yielding commercial and things like that. So the spectrum, anyone can be anywhere. There's a few reasons why you buy commercial. And one is if you want to try to build a passive income quickly, so it can get you there quite quickly. That can come from lifestyle reasons. It can be you want to step away from work part-time, or your partner's having a child and they want to go back to 3 days a week or something like that. So you might buy it there. The other one is if you're trying to build that passive income, actually because of serviceability reasons. So a lot of people, even with residential, will hit their glass ceiling in terms of lending after 2, 3, 4, 5 properties.
Yep.
Commercial can actually increase that as well because you're buying an asset that's for $1 million giving you 50,000 passive income. You can kind of keep moving forward with your portfolio. There's also some lending options that are a bit easier, like lease loans, where they give you a loan based on the strength of the lease. So it's just another option there to kind of keep moving forward. Your risk profile comes to play as well. Like if I've got, mum and dad client with 3 kids and they're struggling financially week to week, even though commercial on paper looks like it's going to perform well for them, give them a passive income and help them out, if it goes vacant, that's too detrimental for them. So I'd probably shift them into a residential over a commercial. So it comes down on a case-by-case basis of what you're trying to achieve, what your risk profile is, and over what time frame you're doing it. There's no point buying a commercial property now to have a passive income in 2 years' time if you plan to work the next 10, 15 years because you love your job. You're better off using the leveraging, buying a low-risk asset class and doing that way. So it's just completely a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, no, and that's the same in resi for that. But anyone who's doing the job properly is looking very specifically at the individual investor's position, goals, capability, and then coming up with a strategy that's going to best satisfy that. So I'd love your approach around that, Steve. Steve, you write a great chapter, and you right at the end of the book, given the times that we're in, around how to survive downturns with commercial property. I'd love to expand on that because that's something that's in people's minds at the moment, and it might give them some comfort around, there are things we can do to mitigate any of these sort of major challenges like pandemics or other big events that are likely to impact on it. Talk us through what they might be and what some of the options are to try and survive during downturn periods.
Yeah, so I always try to buy properties that are going to basically have longevity. So focusing on the 10, 20-year mindset, and then essential service type ones. So people think essential services in like medical and things like that. It doesn't have to be. Industrial is actually essential service. Like everything you touch in your household has been through 3 to 5 warehouses over its life already. So industrial is an essential service. And then retail, focusing on the things where you need face-to-face contact. So medical, physio, barbershops, hair salons, nail salons, things like that. Those have obviously had closed during COVID. So you need to be mindful of that. And some banks work with you and you have to give rental concessions and things like that. But long-term, they're still going to be strong performers. The main benefit of surviving downturns and pandemics and basically curveballs is buy a versatile premise. So if you buy an industrial, buy something that can be a fabrication, a storage, it can be a service-based business, things like that. And then even retail, I know we're kind of talking about how I don't buy office space, but I actually quite like the retail properties that can also be an office. So if you're buying in the main little suburban area, there's nothing saying that that cafe that you own can't be quickly converted into a law office or an accounting firm or anything like that. So versatility is a big thing for me. And then buying in an area where you think is going to be strong over 20, 30 years, much like residential. People get carried away with commercial and they just look short term. It's got the same fundamentals as residential. It's supply and demand. Where are people going to be living? And you can shift there. I've never been a huge fan of buying CBDs, even more so now. So I think there is a big shift away from that into kind of more lifestyle regions.
Yeah, no, good call. What are some of the mistakes that you see people make when it comes to commercial property investing, Steve?
Yeah, the biggest one is people just chasing yield. So they've made the decision that they're going to buy a commercial property, and then they go out and they buy this highest yielding thing that they can. But generally, there's no unicorns. So that high yields come with a risk, and it's either going to be a poor quality tenant or a poor location, so with a high chance of vacancy. So I see a lot of people, they'll go out and they'll just buy like a warehouse in Townsville, for instance, whereas the numbers that I've looked at, vacancy periods are 12 to 24 months as a minimum. So yes, they might get a 7% net yield, but I would much rather buy a 6% net yield in, say, Brisbane, where the vacancy rates are 1.2%, which is generally like 2 to 3 months, with that safety net. So people will just go out and they'll buy this really high yielding asset, and it all looks good on paper at the start. But in 6, 12, 24 months when the tenant leaves, it's no longer near the same net return as buying a good quality kind of safe one. So people will chase yield. And then the other thing that people do is they just don't do the correct due diligence. They'll buy like a lease back property from the owner or something like that, and then the owner will dissolve the company and then they'll sit there vacant. So they've just paid a premium for this property because it's got a long lease that doesn't really exist. Or alternatively, they buy one because it looks attractive because it does have a really high yield on the lease, but they haven't checked the comparables. So they might actually be buying something that's 20% over rented. And then when the lease comes up for renewal, guess what happens? The tenant negotiates it back to 20%. And as capital value of a commercial is based on the rent that you receive, the cap rate, you'll actually lose 20% of your capital just from having a rent reduction. So making sure you've got competitive rent and checking comparables is probably the other one.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Let's expand on that a bit, because that's something that'd be a trap for new players around that cap rate. Let's break that down a little bit, if you don't mind, so that we understand what the cap rate's about and how you can influence it.
So cap rate is capitalization rate, and it's basically net yield. It's an indicator that we use to compare like for like commercials. So if I'm buying a warehouse and I say the cap rate is 6%, that means warehouses with their rent to their purchase price, it should be around 6%. However, it's just the back of an envelope guide. It's not a firm fix, because something with an expensive fit out or in a front location with advertising, for instance, should have a different kind of cost price. But that's generally how you'll value them. So you'll look at the rent received versus the price you're going to pay, and that's how you get the value. So if you get rental increases, that actually means you actually increase capital growth, because if you get a 5% rental increase, because it's valued off the rent that you're receiving, you've actually effectively had 5% capital growth. And that's a nice little way for some investors as well, if you want to do a value add, is buy something that's under rented, and then when you get to the lease renewal, put it up to market rent, and you've actually just fabricated yourself some capital growth.
Beautiful. Is it difficult to, in the current marketplace, to identify commercial opportunities that are under rented?
No, so they're actually quite common. It's just people are unaware of how to actually check comparable rates. Like, they'll just take it on face value, because there's no real data sources where you can just look at and say, oh, this is a square meter rate. You actually have to do basically quite a lot of legwork. You need to go on CoreLogic, look at sales campaigns, what they were renting for, go on Real Commercial, look at what other things are advertised for, speak with 2 or 3 property managers that are on the ground to find out what things are renting for. So it's not like you can just kind of look at residential and go, oh yeah, that should rent for $500 a week. You actually have to do work on every single deal to actually find out what it actually rents for. So they do come up, but it's case by case. And because commercial leases can vary so much, is they might be under rented, and that's because they're on a rental incentive, or they might have no rental increases. So even though they're below market rent, you need to survive the 3 or 4 years with no rental increases. So you can get it. It's probably not like the old days 5 years ago where you could get some really good bargains, but you can still get ones 10, 15% below market rent.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome. What I love about commercial property is the flexibility in terms of the negotiation that you can undergo. And a quick example from my own personal exercise, I was a director on a Bendigo Bank community bank branch quite some years ago, and we were negotiating with the landlord to secure a space in a shopping centre. And because the business was it was a new branch from a ground zero start, we were able to negotiate a transition lease where we actually got we paid no rent at all we signed a 5-year lease. We paid nothing at all for the first 2 years. The third year it was back to its equivalent, and the last 2 years we paid above market rent, so that over the 5-year period the rental came out at the the appropriate level, but it allowed the branch to really sort of ramp up its financial performance without a massive rent chewing into the cash flow in the early days. So if you get the other similar examples of those sorts of approaches and incentives that can be utilised to attract good tenants and keep them, that you've seen around the place, Steve?
Yeah, so similar to what you said, a lot of like cafes and restaurants, you'll give them quite a strong rental incentive, and then that's normally in the form of 3 months rent. So you might give them 3, 4, 5, 6 months free rent at the start, which a lot of residential people are shocked by. But then if they're signing a 5, 7, 10 year, I just bought one in Brisbane actually a couple of weeks ago. It's on a 10-year lease. They've got a 5-month free rental incentive on the property. So it sounds like a lot, but then for the rest of your life, you've got them as a locked-in tenant. And you're normally giving them that because they're increasing the capital value of your property as well. They're renovating the outside, they're fitting out a kitchen. Then a lot of the businesses don't have enough money that they can pay the rent at the start with no income, whilst also paying the renovation, things like that. But there's also opportunity. So you can actually flip it on the other side as well. So I own a cafe up in Brisbane next to a train station. It's a freestanding building. When COVID first hit, he only had about a year and a half left on his lease. And then we obviously had the discussion about rental concessions because of COVID, and he was closing, things like that. And I actually said, hey, I will cover you for the next 3 months while this COVID thing lasts if you sign a fresh 5-year lease. And he was just like, oh, beauty, I'm getting free rent. And I think what he didn't know is I would have given him the 3 months rental concession anyway, but he's now signed a 5-year lease, and I've got him locked in there. So there's things like that you can do. But you got to be mindful of those rental concessions, as we spoke about before, the due diligence, because like your Bendigo Bank one where you're paying over rent, if an investor comes in, he buys that thinking that's the market rate, and then when you get to next release renewal, you reduce it, he's going to burn himself.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it comes back to that due diligence piece again that you've mentioned a couple of times. I guess the other sort of flexibility in the exercise and something we did years ago from a business perspective was to get the landlord to foot the bill for the fit out and then amortise that into the rent, so that we didn't have to come up with that big capital outlay. We paid a rental premium for it, but it meant from a cash flow perspective, particularly in the early days of the establishment of that business, it was a lot easier to navigate and put itself on a strong, profitable footing. Are there others?
I had the same thing with a medical tenant about 3 years ago with a client. We actually paid for the fit out. So it's a quite expensive fit out. The client, it was, I think, $400,000-$500,000 from memory. And then he got him on a 10-year lease. But by him paying that, it was about a $2 million property. So quite a large percentage. That property went to $4 million just because of the tenant and the fit out that he had. So he was sort of looking at effectively the same concept as a renovation on a residential property, but he's doing it in a capital growth perspective by having a medical center effectively. So you can do things like that as well. And that's what I love about commercial is there are actually no rules. It is actually the Wild West. You can negotiate and put anything you want on a contract. Whereas residential, you generally have to follow obviously the typical kind of market, but this is just besides the Retail Leasing Act, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, it's fan. And in that example you painted, that medical centre, spending $500,000 to effectively double the value of the property it's an absolute no-brainer. So yeah, no, I love that. You've covered a lot of territory very succinctly, Steve. I love your work there. Is there anything that we haven't covered before we switch into the Fast Five ambush round that you think is going to be really important for potential commercial investors to understand?
No, more so just get educated before you jump in. It's a lot more moving parts than residential. So you don't want to just go in and listen to your Uncle Remus who tells you to buy an industrial in Western Sydney, for instance. Really do your work and your due diligence just before you're trying to jump in.
Yeah, no, very well said, mate. It's like, I mean, if you treat it like learning a new language, and that's the approach you take, and get to the point where you understand the language before you actually then commit yourself, and or surround yourself with the right independent professionals who can guide and protect you on that journey. That's far better than, as you say, taking advice from Uncle Jack and then leaping in without really understanding what you're getting yourself into. Love that, mate.
Spot on.
Brilliant. Okay, well, let's jump into the ambush round then. And these are just the fast five questions that I ask all of the listeners that the audience loves to get your words of wisdom on. First of those, mate, is what's your favourite quote and why?
Oh, favorite quote. I saw a good one on social media a couple of weeks ago, and it was, there's two ways to be wealthy. One's to increase your income, and the other one is to lower your expectation.
Love it, mate. Absolutely love it. And false expectations is certainly that a lot of people are plagued with these days. So spot on. Now, apart from your awesome book, Commercial Property Investing Explained Simply, what's the top book that you'd recommend the listeners have a read of, and why?
So it's not so much the top book, but it's probably the one closest to my heart. It's actually Margaret Lomas's book, The 20 Must-Ask Questions. And the reason for that, it's actually my first property book that I read. And that was the first time I actually looked at property in a different light of going, okay, this is actually quite analytical here. You can actually master this. It's not just a simple buy, set and forget type strategy. Yeah,
love it. No, that good advice. Now this one's a little bit left field, but most Aussies believe they pay too much tax. So what's the top legal thing that you've done to minimise the tax that you pay, mate?
But to be honest, get a good accountant. That's the easiest way. But before I make any purchase or do anything kind of largely financial, I call my accountant and I say, this is what I'm doing. Is this correct? And he tells me exactly what I do. You can't be the jack of all trades. So I get a lot of people, a lot of my clients, I'll try to understand self-managed super funds and trust structures and things like that, but they're ideally going back to their accountant anyway. So why not just find a good accountant and pay him to do it for you?
Love it. Now, in terms of investment advice, what's both the worst and the best investment advice that you've ever received to date?
Probably buy property. That's the best and the worst one. So by that, I mean, when people say buy a family home, which I did early on, I think probably number 7 or 8 in my portfolio, I bought a family home because property is, you need that nest egg thing. However, that's not analytical. That's just buying with emotion. So buying property is the best and the worst advice that I got.
Yeah, well covered. And finally then, mate, what's a personal habit that you believe has contributed most to your investment success today?
To be honest, probably just showing genuine care. And I know that sounds a bit airy-fairy and people say it all the time, but 99.9% of business owners actually don't care. That they're just trying to increase their business. But if you show a genuine interest in someone and they sense that, that actually benefits you. And it can be in personal life, it can be in my business, even with real estate agents. If you show genuine care to them and a relationship, they'll send you good quality properties.
Yeah, good call. Talk to us about how you actually demonstrate genuine care, mate. What's it look like?
I think we've had this discussion before, Bushy. It's actually just showing interest in their life and finding out exactly what is going to make them happy. And then once you've found that out and you can actually show them with numbers, not just kind of selling the dream like some people do, show them with numbers, this is what's achievable if we hit these goalposts. then they automatically get the trust there.
Yeah, no, very well said, mate. Well, to wrap things up, mate, I'd normally like to ask a big question. So if I gave you a microphone that spoke to every single one of the 7.7 billion odd people that are currently alive in the world, and I gave you 60 seconds to talk, what would you tell people to get invested in?
All right, so the clear answer for me is obviously commercial property, if it's right for you. However, you don't have to buy commercial. There are so many asset classes out there. Find the one that you're actually really interested in, that you're actually going to enjoy along the way, because there's no point doing it for 10, 15 years if you're not going to enjoy it. So make sure you enjoy it. Set some reasonable goalposts. Don't try to get rich quick, and just do it over the long term and enjoy the ride along the way.
Yeah, beautifully said. Beautifully said, mate. For those amongst us who really whet their appetite to the opportunity that commercial property is presenting, and they want to get in touch with you, mate, how do they do that?
All right, so you feel free to stalk me on social media. So if you just type in Steve Palise, you'll find me on LinkedIn or Facebook or things like that. My company's called Palise Property. You can email me at steve@paliseproperty.com. But yeah, quick stalk online, you'll find me pretty quickly.
And of course, we're certainly going to be suggesting that for those that really do want to invest in their education around commercial property, grab yourself a copy of Steve's recent release book, Commercial Property Investing Explained Simply. It's a great read. I've read it from cover to cover, and really does give you the cradle to grave run through the whole process. It really is a good starting point to get your knowledge to a level where you can start to reach out to someone like yourself and then do that. What sort of people, if you were to define the ideal client for Palise Property, what position have they got to be in? What do they need to bring to the table to be a good fit for what you can do for them?
To be honest, it's going to be very varied. Like, you'll generally need about $150,000 equity or cash to kind of get started in like a 300K plus commercial property. But I've got clients that I've bought a 180 grand warehouse for, and ones that I've bought $11 million shopping centers for. So anyone who's just interested in passive income can reach out to me. That's fine.
Brilliant. Mate, really appreciate you getting up early in the UK and sharing that knowledge with us. Look forward to seeing you back in Oz. You're really living and breathing what you talk. By being in the UK, but still running a successful buyer's agency business in the commercial space here in Australia. So fully commend you for doing that, mate, and really enjoy your time on coming on the show today.
No worries. Thanks for your time, Bush. It's been great.
Good on you. Thanks, mate. To get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello@khgroup.com.au. It's HELLO@khgroup.com.au, or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au/Get Invested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening, and as always, dream as if you'll live forever and live as if you'll die